The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of money and ambition, a potent cocktail that usually thrilled me. Tonight it just felt suffocating. I smoothed the silk of my gown, a deep emerald that subtly shimmered under the chandeliers, a silent rebellion against the muted tones favored by the city's elite. My heels clicked softly on the polished marble as I navigated through the labyrinth of self-congratulatory smiles and air kisses. This was his world, a world I'd married into, but one that still felt foreign, a gilded cage I was constantly trying to find the key to. He was across the room, already deep in conversation, his booming laugh echoing a little too loudly. Richard, my husband, the man who, in a few short minutes, would redefine my existence in the most public and humiliating way possible. I watched him, a strange detachment settling over me. He was charming, undeniably, with that easy smile and a knack for making everyone feel like the most important person in the room, as long as they served his purpose. Tonight, his purpose was clear: impress the investors for his latest venture, a tech firm he swore would revolutionize. Well, something or other. I usually tuned out the specifics. My role was to be the beautiful silent accessory, the perfectly coiffed arm candy that subtly validated his success. A waiter glided by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one, the bubbles doing little to lighten the lead in my stomach. The murmurs around me were of stocks, acquisitions, and the staggering sums being pledged tonight for the Gala's charity auction. It was for a good cause, of course, children's literacy. But for many, it was just another stage for their performative philanthropy. I'd already pledged a substantial sum, quietly, through an anonymous donation. I preferred to let the money speak for itself, rather than use it as a prop in this elaborate social charade. Then he was there, his hand on the small of my back, a proprietary gesture that always made my skin crawl a little. "Darling, there you are," he murmured, his voice a low purr. He turned to the group he'd been chatting with, a cluster of suited men and pearl-clad women, their eyes assessing me with practiced nonchalance. "Gentlemen, ladies," he announced, a wide, proud smile plastered on his face, "I'd like to introduce you to, just my wife." The words hung in the air, a bell tolling the end of something I hadn't even realized was dying. Just my wife. Not my partner, not my confidant, not even the woman who manages our household and often gives me sound financial advice. As if my identity was solely defined by my marital status, and even then, diminished to a mere appendage. My smile, which had been a polite curve, faltered. A flush crept up my neck, hot and mortifying. I felt every eye on me, every subtle shift in posture, every knowing glance. The gilded cage had just shrunk. The polite smiles around us remained fixed, but I felt a seismic shift beneath the surface, a tremor that ran through me, not the marble floor. It wasn't just the words. It was the casual dismissal, the lack of acknowledgement for anything beyond my purely decorative role. In that instant, every quiet contribution, every shrewd investment decision I'd made on our behalf, every late night spent balancing the books of his company when his team had messed up, every charity event I'd meticulously organized, all of it evaporated into the ether. I was reduced to a footnote, a placeholder. My hand instinctively tightened on the champagne flute. I could feel Richard's arm still resting on my back, a dead weight. The air, once thick with ambition, now felt heavy with a suffocating silence. A silence only I seemed to hear. A phantom heat began to bloom in my chest, not the flush of embarrassment, but something far more dangerous. It was the slow burn of indignation, a feeling I usually suppressed with practiced ease. But tonight, it felt like a silent inferno, licking at the edges of my composure. I met the eyes of one of the women in the group, a socialite known for her sharp wit and even sharper business acumen. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of understanding that passed between us, a shared secret of being underestimated in a world dominated by men. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. It was a lifeline in the churning waters of my humiliation. Richard, oblivious, continued to hold court, already moving on to discuss the finer points of his latest projected revenue. His voice was a dull drone in my ears. My mind, however, was suddenly crystal clear. The fuzzy edges of my discontent sharpened into a laser focus. For years I had played the role, accepted the unspoken rules. I had supported, advised, and often silently course-corrected, all while remaining in his shadow, believing it was the right thing to do, the wifely thing to do. But in his casual dismissal, he had not only erased my contributions, he had erased me. My eyes drifted across the ballroom, past the glittering diamonds and designer suits, past the forced smiles and performative grandeur. I saw the auction stage, bathed in a spotlight, waiting for the night's main event. An idea, cold and precise, began to form in the crucible of my newfound resolve. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about making a statement that wouldn't require a single word from me. A statement that would reverberate through this room, through his world, with an undeniable, resounding impact. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, allowing the bubbles to prickle my tongue. The metallic tang of ambition, usually so off-putting, now tasted like opportunity. The polite smile I affixed back to my face felt different this time. It wasn't a mask for discomfort, but a shield, and behind it, a strategy was rapidly taking shape. I had been called just his wife. Tonight I would prove that just was the most dangerous word he could have chosen. I excused myself from the group with a sweet, almost saccharine smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Richard, still engrossed in his spiel, barely registered my departure. He assumed I was heading to the powder room, or perhaps to gossip with the other wives. He couldn't have been more wrong. My destination was far more strategic. My path led directly to the registration desk for the auction. The room buzzed with pre-auction excitement, but I moved with a focused calm, every nerve alight. The woman at the desk, a harried event coordinator, looked up as I approached. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the tempest brewing within me. "I'd like to update my bidder registration for the charity auction tonight." She blinked, surprised. "Certainly, ma'am. What name is it under?" "It's under Richard's name," I replied, a subtle emphasis on his name. "However, I'd like to link a separate account for my bids tonight. And I want to ensure my bids are announced as from an anonymous donor, for the first few items, then under my own name." I gave her my full name, the one that had slowly been eclipsed by Mrs. Richard last name. Felt good, a small act of defiance. She nodded, typing quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. "And the account you'd like to link?" I discreetly handed her a slip of paper with a series of numbers. It was the account for my personal investment portfolio, one I'd built independently over the years, carefully, quietly, a separate financial entity that Richard knew little about. He thought my allowance was simply for my personal shopping and charities. He had no idea the extent of my own financial acumen or the substantial growth I'd achieved. "And," I added, lowering my voice slightly, "if the bidding for any of the major lots starts to slow, or if it looks like they won't reach their full potential, please let me know. I'm prepared to be aggressive." The word hung in the air, a silent promise. She looked up, a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or a nascent understanding. She simply nodded, a tight smile on her face. "Understood, ma'am." I then moved to a vantage point near the back of the room, close enough to see the bidding paddles, yet far enough to maintain a certain anonymity. I watched Richard. He was still networking, blissfully unaware of the financial earthquake about to hit his meticulously constructed world. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. This wasn't about tearing him down entirely, not yet. It was about exposing a truth he had conveniently overlooked. It was about showing him and everyone in this room that just his wife was capable of far more than he could ever comprehend. The auctioneer took the stage, his voice booming through the sound system, announcing the first item. The usual polite, hesitant bids began. I waited, observing the rhythm of the room, the subtle cues of who was serious and who was merely playing along. My heart, which had been a frantic drumbeat earlier, was now a steady, powerful rhythm, pulsing with purpose. Tonight I wasn't just observing. I was orchestrating. The first few items on the auction block went as expected. Modest bids, polite applause. I remained still, my paddle resting on my lap, a silent observer in the symphony of self-importance. Richard, meanwhile, had finally spotted me. He gave a casual wave, a faint smile on his lips, undoubtedly thinking I was admiring his networking prowess. He had no idea the storm about to break. Then came the first of the major lots. A rare manuscript, estimated to fetch a considerable sum. The bids climbed steadily, then began to slow. The auctioneer's voice filled the lull, coaxing higher numbers. Just as he was about to drop the hammer, I raised my paddle. 500,000. My voice, amplified by a sudden, inexplicable confidence, rang out. A ripple went through the room. It was significantly higher than the last bid. The auctioneer's eyes widened momentarily. And from paddle number. "Ah, an anonymous donor," he announced. A few heads turned in my direction, trying to pinpoint the source. Richard, now looking over, frowned slightly, trying to place the unfamiliar paddle number. The bidding continued for a few more items. Each time I waited for the opportune moment, subtly increasing the stakes, pushing the numbers higher than anyone anticipated. Each time the announcement was the same. From an anonymous donor. The murmurs grew louder. People started speculating. Who was this mysterious, wealthy individual? Then came the item I had been waiting for. A significant art piece, the centerpiece of the auction, estimated at several million. This was the one Richard's company was eyeing, planning to acquire it for their new corporate headquarters, a highly visible purchase that would signify their arrival in the upper echelons of the industry. He had boasted about it earlier, how it would be his company's crown jewel. Bidding started strong, but I noticed a slight hesitation from Richard's representative, seated a few rows ahead. He was conferring nervously on his phone. Perhaps their budget was tighter than they let on, or maybe they just weren't prepared for a truly competitive bid. The numbers climbed, inch by agonizing inch, until they stalled at $3 million. The auctioneer paused, ready to deliver the final call. This was my moment. I lifted my paddle, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, resolute certainty. My voice, now steady and clear, cut through the hushed anticipation. $5 million. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. 5 million. It was a staggering leap. Richard, who had been chatting animatedly, froze. His head snapped in my direction, his jaw visibly dropping. He stared at me, then at the auctioneer, then back at me, a dawning horror spreading across his face. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned, stammered. "And that bid, ladies and gentlemen, for $5 million comes from..." He checked his notes, then looked directly at me, a wide, appreciative smile spreading across his face. "It comes from Mrs., my full name." The name, my name, echoed through the vast space. It was not an anonymous donor. It was not just his wife. It was my name, loud and clear, attached to a sum that far surpassed anything Richard's company had bid, a sum that overshadowed even their projected purchase. Silence descended, thick and absolute. Every eye in the room was on me. Richard was on his feet now, a mixture of disbelief and fury contorting his features. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The socialite from earlier caught my eye and offered a subtle, knowing smirk. This wasn't just a donation. It was a detonation. And the fallout was just beginning. The silence in the ballroom stretched, taut and electric, before shattering into a cacophony of whispers. Every conversation had ceased. Every eye, initially on me, now darted to Richard, then back to me, trying to decipher the unfolding drama. His face, usually a mask of effortless charm, was a roadmap of shock, confusion, and then a blazing fury. He looked like a man who just watched his meticulously constructed sandcastle dissolve in a rogue wave. He stalked towards me, his stride purposeful. His eyes narrowed into slits. I met his gaze without flinching. There was no fear, no regret, just a profound sense of liberation. The gilded cage had not only been unlocked, its bars had been utterly dismantled. "What in God's name was that?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous, barely audible over the renewed buzz in the room. His hand clamped onto my arm, a tight grip that usually intimidated me into submission. Tonight it felt like a mosquito bite. I simply smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that hadn't graced my lips in years. "That, Richard," I replied, my voice calm and clear, "was my donation." His grip tightened further. "My company was bidding on that piece. That was for our new headquarters. Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was escalating, attracting more attention. "Oh, I have a very clear idea," I said, my gaze sweeping over the crowd that was now openly staring. "I've ensured that a truly magnificent piece of art found a generous home. And more importantly, I've ensured that children's literacy receives a substantial boost tonight." My eyes flicked meaningfully to the auctioneer, who gave me a knowing nod. The socialite from earlier, her eyes bright with amusement, subtly raised her glass in a silent toast. Others in the room, particularly the women who had endured similar silent dismissals, offered small, almost imperceptible nods of approval. They understood. Richard's face was purple with rage. "You humiliated me. In front of everyone. Our investors are here." "You humiliated yourself, Richard," I stated, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, "when you introduced me as just your wife. Perhaps you've forgotten that just your wife is also a woman with her own resources, her own mind, and her own substantial financial portfolio. A portfolio, I might add, that appears to be significantly healthier than your company's bid for that painting." The sting of the last remark was intentional, a direct hit to his ego and his carefully curated image of financial dominance. He reeled back as if struck. The casual crowd of onlookers was now a captivated audience. This wasn't just a charity auction anymore. It was a very public, very personal reckoning. Richard, a man who thrived on control and public perception, was rapidly losing both. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling before their very eyes, and I was holding the sledgehammer. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said, my voice carrying just enough for those nearest to hear, "I believe the auctioneer is waiting for me to finalize my donation." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone, adrift in a sea of curious, calculating stares. Every step was lighter, more purposeful than the last. The weight of years of unspoken grievances, of being overlooked and underestimated, had finally lifted. I walked towards the auctioneer, the path parting before me like a red carpet event. My smile was genuine now, radiant. There was a lightness in my step, an exhilaration that coursed through my veins, far more intoxicating than any champagne. I reached the stage and shook the auctioneer's hand, confirming the donation with a quiet dignity. The applause that followed was not just for the generous sum, but for the unspoken narrative that had just unfolded. As I descended the steps, I saw him again. Richard. He was still standing where I'd left him, surrounded by a growing circle of murmuring onlookers. His face a mask of disbelief. The power had shifted. The narrative had changed. He was no longer the undisputed star of his own show. He was a character in my story, and not a very flattering one. Later that evening, after the last gavel had fallen and the final polite goodbyes were exchanged, I found myself outside, breathing in the cool night air. The city lights glittered around me, no longer feeling like the oppressive bars of a cage, but like distant stars beckoning. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Richard. I looked at the caller ID, then slipped the phone back into my purse. The conversation could wait. Or perhaps it didn't need to happen at all. This was not just about a painting or a donation. It was about reclaiming my voice, my identity, my worth. The just his wife era was over. I had shown them, and more importantly, I had shown myself, that I was a force to be reckoned with, a woman with her own power, her own resources, and her own profound impact. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, The uncertainty felt like a thrilling promise, not a looming threat. The horizon was vast, filled with possibilities I had previously suppressed. I took a deep breath, the scent of blooming jasmine mingling with the city's exhaust, and hailed a cab. My journey had just truly begun. I wasn't merely walking away from a gala. I was stepping into a future of my own making, ready to define myself on my own terms.